You can survive alcohol. You can overcome drugs. You can even break free from pornography. But there's one addiction so spiritually lethal that God will destroy everything in your life to prevent you from having it, because if He doesn't intervene, it will destroy your eternal purpose. We talk endlessly about the obvious addictions, the bottles hidden in closets, the pills counted obsessively, the screens glowing in dark rooms. Churches have recovery programs for these. We understand them. We can see them. But what if I told you there's an addiction that walks through church doors every Sunday, sits in the front row, raises its hands in worship, and quotes scripture fluently? An addiction so deceptive that the person suffering from it is often the last to recognize it. An addiction that doesn't slur your speech or track your arms, but slowly calculates the death of your destiny. Sarah stood on the platform that Wednesday night, leading worship like she had for 8 years. Her voice was flawless. Her hands lifted at precisely the right moments. The congregation followed her into the presence of God, or so it seemed. What they didn't know was that Sarah hadn't actually felt God's presence in months. She was operating on muscle memory, on gifting, on sheer competence. And it was working. People were crying. Hands were raised. Someone even came forward for prayer. This is what made her addiction so dangerous. It produced results. It looked like righteousness. It felt like devotion. But Sarah wasn't addicted to God. She was addicted to being the person everyone needed. To having the answers. To never breaking. To being indispensable. When Pastor James approached her after service with those words, "Sarah, we need to talk about your role," she smiled confidently, assuming it was about expansion. She had no idea God had just lit the match that would burn down everything she'd built her identity on. Some addictions are too dangerous to manage. They can only be eradicated. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. 17 minutes to dismantle 8 years. Pastor James was kind but firm. The worship department was being restructured. Fresh vision. New direction. They'd be bringing in someone from outside. Sarah could stay on the team, of course, just not as the leader. He thanked her for her faithful service, prayed a brief prayer, and walked out, leaving her sitting in that small office wondering if she'd just imagined the entire conversation. She drove home in silence. Not the peaceful kind, the suffocating kind, where your thoughts scream so loud you can't hear anything else. This wasn't possible. She'd given everything to that ministry. She'd sacrificed relationships, time, sleep. She'd prayed for every service, prepared meticulously, poured her heart out week after week. And now what? Demoted? Replaced? The rage came first. Then the rationalization. They were making a mistake. They'd see it eventually. She just needed to prove herself indispensable again. She'd work harder, pray longer, be even more available. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she'd already constructed a plan to demonstrate her value so clearly they'd have no choice but to reverse this decision. What Sarah didn't understand yet was that this wasn't about her performance. God hadn't allowed this because she was failing, He allowed it because she was succeeding at the wrong thing. She'd become a master at ministry while remaining a stranger to dependency. She knew how to lead worship but had forgotten how to simply sit in His presence without an agenda. She could quote scripture about God being enough, but her life screamed that she needed to be needed more than she needed Him. And God, who loved her too much to let her continue down this path, had just begun the painful surgery of setting her free. Over the next 6 months, Sarah watched her entire world systematically collapse. It wasn't dramatic, there was no scandal, no public failure. It was worse. It was quiet erosion. The friends who used to call her for advice stopped reaching out. The mentoring relationships dried up. The invitations to speak at women's conferences ceased. Even her small group seemed to function just fine without her insights. She tried everything. She initiated coffee dates that felt awkward and forced. She volunteered for every church project, but somehow her offers were politely declined or given to others. She posted encouraging messages on social media that barely got any likes. It was as if she'd become invisible, irrelevant overnight. The depression hit like a fog she couldn't shake. She'd wake up at 3 in the morning, chest tight with anxiety, scrolling through old photos of herself on stage, surrounded by people, needed, significant. Who was she if she wasn't that person? The question haunted her. She'd built her entire identity on being strong for others, and now that no one needed her strength, she felt like she was disappearing. Her prayer life became a battlefield. She'd start with worship and end up yelling at God. "I served you faithfully. I gave you everything. Why are you doing this to me?" The silence that followed was deafening. No answers. No comfort. Just emptiness. What Sarah couldn't see yet was that God wasn't punishing her, he was unclenching her fists. Every person she'd held onto for validation, every position she'd clung to for identity, every platform she'd used to prove her worth, he was gently prying them from her grip. Because as long as she could find her significance in anything other than him, she'd never truly know him. And God wanted more for her than a life of spiritual performance. He wanted communion. But first, she had to lose everything she thought made her somebody. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Sarah sat in her car outside the grocery store, unable to go in. Not because she didn't need groceries, she did. But because she'd just seen through the window that Rebecca, her replacement as worship leader, was inside. And Sarah realized with crushing clarity that she couldn't face her. Not because Rebecca had done anything wrong, but because seeing her would force Sarah to confront the truth she'd been running from for months. She wasn't angry at Rebecca. She was angry at God. And beneath the anger was something even more terrifying. She wasn't sure she knew who God was anymore outside of what he could do through her. That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah did something she hadn't done in years. She didn't pray with an agenda. She didn't open her Bible to find an encouraging verse. She didn't put on worship music to manufacture a feeling. She just sat in the silence and let herself feel the full weight of her emptiness. And then, quietly, she whispered the words she'd been too proud to say, "I don't know how to just be with you. I only know how to serve you. I only know how to perform. And I'm so tired. I don't even know if you love me when I'm not useful." The tears came then, not the pretty kind that come during worship services, but the ugly, guttural kind that come from a soul finally admitting it's been starving. She cried for the girl she used to be before she learned that love was something you earned through usefulness. She cried for the years she'd spent building a ministry while neglecting intimacy. She cried because she'd been so busy being strong for everyone else that she'd forgotten how to be weak before God. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in her circumstances, those remained unchanged. But in her spirit. For the first time in her life, Sarah stopped trying to be enough and simply let herself need him. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There was no lightning bolt moment where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, it was a slow unfurling, like a fist that's been clenched so long it takes time to remember how to open. Sarah started showing up to church differently. Not as the worship leader everyone depended on, but as just another broken person desperate for grace. She sat in the back row and let herself actually receive instead of always giving. She discovered what it meant to worship without performing, to pray without an audience, to simply exist in God's presence without needing to justify her space there. The most surprising thing happened: she began to hear his voice again. Not the loud, directive voice she'd known in her ministry days, but the intimate whisper of a father who'd been waiting patiently for her to stop talking long enough to listen. He didn't scold her for her addiction to being needed. He simply loved her in her neediness. Slowly, imperceptibly, her identity shifted. She was no longer Sarah, the indispensable worship leader. She was simply Sarah, the beloved daughter. And from that place of security, something genuine began to grow, not ministry built on her competence, but overflow built on his presence. A year later, when Pastor James asked if she'd consider leading worship again, Sarah's response surprised them both. "Can I pray about it?" Not because she was being spiritual, but because she genuinely needed to know if it was God's invitation or her old addiction resurfacing. 3 days later, she said yes. But this time, she walked onto that platform as someone who knew she had nothing to prove. She wasn't there to be needed. She was there because she'd been invited by the only one whose approval actually mattered. And for the first time in her life, when she lifted her hands in worship, she wasn't performing for a crowd. She was communing with the God who loved her enough to strip away everything false so she could finally experience what was real. Some addictions can only be healed through absolute surrender. And sometimes the greatest mercy God can give His chosen ones is the complete destruction of everything they're using to replace Him.